In Hannah Arendt's famous book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, she makes the important case that totalitarianism is a distinctive form of government that's quite different to tyranny or the kind of military dictatorship that's existed throughout all of history. She writes that totalitarianism is a form of government that aims to completely abolish the distinction between state and individual, and it's a system that claims to have discovered the fundamental laws of the universe. It claims to know everything that happened throughout history and everything that would happen in the future. Mussolini, who used the word totalitarian as a positive in his speeches, said that there was nothing outside of the state, and that the totalitarian state was a kind of extended family, or an enlarged community, where every person would find their proper place and their proper role. Hannah Arendt's book was written in 1951, just 2 years after Chairman Mao founds the People's Republic of China, where he then goes on to found what was probably the worst totalitarian state in history. And so at the time Arendt is writing, she could claim that there's only ever been two totalitarian states, which she said was Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. But by the end of her life, in the mid-1970s, the total number of dictatorships in the world rises to the greatest number in history, which encompasses almost half of the world's population. Thankfully, we no longer live in the golden age of totalitarianism. Today, more than 2/3 of people in the world live under countries that are characterized as free by most researchers. And so the high point of dictatorship in the 1970s gives way to a wave of democratic transitions in the 1980s that eventually culminates in the fall of the Soviet Union and continues until the mid-2000s. This is what was called by Samuel Huntington as the third wave of democracy, which follows a second wave of democratic transitions after World War II and a first wave of democratic transitions after World War I. What's the case in modern day, however, is that the world has been in a democratic recession since the mid-2000s and has now seen over 15 years of democratic decline in the world. And the reason for this is that just as democracies innovate and develop new and better democratic institutions, autocracies also do the same thing. And we live in a period where there's a new kind of autocratic system based on mass data gathering and economic colonization that's sweeping the world. And this is represented most clearly by China in modern day. And so this kind of makes up almost a fourth wave of autocracies, which carry on from a sort of first autocratic state, which is represented by the absolute monarchies of the pre-modern societies, and a second wave which is characterized by the imperialist states of the 19th century, and then a third made up by the totalitarian states of the 20th century. It's often argued by contemporary academics that China today is authoritarian but not totalitarian, because its political system is not total. It allows some measure of personal and economic freedom, if not some political freedom, or that it may represent some kind of soft totalitarianism, if there could be such a thing. The vast tools of state repression only exist at the margins of society. But I want to argue here that it should be clear to everybody today that modern China has become increasingly more like a totalitarian state, although it's one that's developed more sophisticated tools of state repression. It still remains embedded in a totalitarian doctrine that it tries to export to the rest of the world. And so, using the following examples, I want to kind of more carefully outline the totalitarian doctrine that's developed in 21st century China by comparing it with other authoritarian states. So without further ado, I'll get into the comparisons. Part 1. Imperial Japan. It's easy to forget, when discussing the rise of authoritarian China, that there was once another rising power that dominated all of Asia, and presented itself as a serious alternative to European models of development. So Japan was one of the most powerful authoritarian powers of its day, and in many ways it was much better at being authoritarian than China is today. If one looks closely at the models of development of Japan in the early 20th century and China in the early 21st, they'll find that the similarities are more than striking. Both powers presented themselves as alternative models of economic development to the West. Both encouraged ethnic emigration to expand influence. Both grew their economies by becoming industrial exporters. Both directed state investment with a set of national banks. Both had large problems dealing with ultranationalists in their own citizens. And both made small steps towards democratic reform, but reversed course after a financial crisis. In Japan's case, the financial crisis of 1927, and in China's case, the financial crises of 2008 and 2015. So in Japan's case, the export-led growth was mostly achieved by exporting things like industrial equipment, trains, railways, and military equipment. The kind of things that newly industrialized states in the 19th century wanted. In China's case, in the early 2000s, the same strategy was pursued using cheap plastic toys, electronics, and clothes. The kind of things that were, valuable to developing countries in the 21st century. And the construction of a modern financial sector in Japan's case involved the creation of the Zaibatsu banks, which were sort of family conglomerates that were applied on top of an elite class in Japanese society. Whereas the Chinese financial restructuring involved the reform of an incredibly corrupt banking sector in the 1990s, which involved letting many banks and companies fail if they weren't profitable, and giving bankers a week to declare undeclared assets or face prison, based on an American federalist model of finance. And so that was part of Chinese financial reform in the 1990s. So the economic similarities are there on paper, but what about the underlying ideology? Because obviously Imperial Japan and autocratic China have very different historical origins, come out of very different contexts. One of the most interesting things about Imperial Japan is that it adopts an ideology of European imperialism as a state policy at just a time when the whole idea of imperialism is being rejected in Europe. So after World War I, the whole idea of territorial expansion and nationalism is, denounced as having caused the Great War. But just a few years later, Japanese propaganda is singing the praises of imperialism and urging Japanese people to become 1,000 hearts beating as one, and to unite the 8 corners of the world under one roof, referencing things like Japanese mythology. So this partly has its origins in the sort of justification of Japan as a newly industrialized country, and it kind of viewed imperialism as a way to speed up its development compared to more mature industrial countries. So the justification for annexing Taiwan and turning Korea into a puppet state during the First Sino-Japanese War in the 1890s is that these states were ruled by sort of feudal tyrannies under the domain of China at the time, and that feudal China was keeping these states backwards, and that Japan hoped that it could kind of persuade them to become more modernized and adopt modernization policies that it had adopted during the Meiji Restoration. But if it couldn't persuade them, it was perfectly happy to use military force to get its way. And so Japan sends troops into Korea in 1894 to rise up against a government installed by the Chinese general Yun Shikai. And so Taiwan and Korea effectively become these proxy wars between China and Japan in the late 19th century. And Japan forces these unequal treaties on China, just as the European powers had done. Because the thinking from Japan was that if they don't do it, then another power will come along and do it to China instead. Another interesting thing about Japan is that even as it goes through its so-called democratic period in the 1920s, it still continues to engage in these international wars, although on a very small scale compared to what it would do during the Second World War. So was Imperial Japan democratic? Well, Japan creates an elected body in the 1890s called the Imperial Diet, which is elected based on property requirements, pretty much what a lot of European states had, so what kind of Britain and America already had for a few years. So it's actually one of the first countries to adopt this method. And just like China in the 1920s, Japan sees democracy simply as a technique, as a way of gaining power, rather than something that's morally desirable in itself, because the West had it. So they were trying to copy it. And when they create this sort of parliamentary body successfully, Japanese conservative papers will say that this is the result of the superior race of the Japanese people. But actually, the Diet that's created, the parliamentary body, they're elected and they have the power to accept or reject budgets that are put in front of it. But they don't make up the cabinet of the government, and so they don't really inform military policy, and they don't have a lot of control over day-to-day decision-making in the government. So really, they're very, very limited in the power that they have. And the cabinet is made by mostly former samurai, who then get rewarded by the emperor for these territorial conquests. And so, as a result of these structural problems, Japan over time just gets dominated by this sort of military oligarchy that manipulates the parliament or manipulates the Diet to just get its own way. And they do this because although there are increases in voting eligibility in the 1920s, these are also accompanied by increasingly draconian legislation that allows Japanese police to arrest anybody, basically even for discussing ideas alluding to socialism. And this is because you have the background of a rising sort of Bolshevik revolution going on in the background. And in a way, the Japanese government kind of overreacts to these political forces that are going on. You also have a kind of an international movement of ultranationalist groups, and repeated ultranationalist coup attempts and riots in the 1930s. They managed to push Japan basically towards becoming a dictatorship. But because the coups don't succeed, Japan never becomes this sort of fanatical political state like the other totalitarian states do in the 20th century. And so it doesn't engage in the cult of personality or the mass purges that you see, for example, under the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany. No such democratic forms ever happen in China. The democratic successes in the 1910s are pretty much stalled by the Civil War and then completely abolished when the CCP take over. And then the CCP the communists engage in some tepid democratic reforms in the 1980s, but they're basically limited to allowing elected agricultural ministers and some elections of a legislative body. But even these, very small reforms, are just removed by Xi Jinping's government when he takes over, because they get in the way of state planning. So all of this would seem to strengthen the arguments of the institutionalists. They're kind of a subset of realists who argue that democratic failures are simply a result of institutional failures. They're the result of bad political bodies that are set up imperfectly, and they simply don't work. So people like Francis Fukuyama and Akameglu and Robinson, who wrote Why Nations Fail. So this group tend to argue that. But for a real comparison, you also have to examine the underlying ideological currents which leads the countries to make the decisions that they did. One other interesting similarity is how both countries justify their own territorial expansion. So Japanese writers wrote that Japanese colonialism was different to Western imperialism because the Japanese were more spiritually in touch with Asian lifestyle and the needs of the Asian people, and they were therefore more benevolent rather than exploitative like Western imperialism was supposed to be. Which would have been quite a revelation to, the thousands of people in Southeast Asia who were forced into labour camps under Japanese occupation. And so these Japanese military theorists in the 1930s, they developed the idea of the Greater Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which aims to create a giant Japanese empire that dominates all across the Pacific and is ruled by Japan and extends even to the Caribbean and South America. And so despite holding the idea that the Japanese colonial rule is beneficial for Asians and all of the Asian people, the Japanese government clarifies in 1941 by saying that although we use the expression Asian cooperation, this by no means ignores the fact that Japan was created by the gods or posits an automatic racial equality. So that was good to know. So the whole ideology of Japanese imperialism was that, yes, we're going to invade and take over other Asian countries, but ultimately we're going to develop them and turn them into states like ours so that all Asian people can become independent. And you can see in these justifications the same kind of double thing that's present in China's justification for its annexation or policies in Xinjiang and Tibet and Inner Mongolia, and their attempts to annex the entirety of the South China Sea. Because these sort of three ethnic provinces, all acquired at various times by different Chinese dynasties, but they're independent for the vast majority of their history. So instead of a natural expression of self-determination among these minorities, for the Chinese state, these populations have simply failed to recognize that they are actually Chinese, and they must be forcibly coerced into recognizing that for their own good. The CCP today will happily blame almost all of China's problems on a history of Western colonialism, while at the same time denying that its colonization of other territories is anything comparable. And Japan, just like modern China, at first encourages the presence of ultranationalist groups, which it believes can be used to aid its domestic policies, it believes it can use to its advantage. And then it later backtracks when it realizes that this is causing problems for it. So the traditional explanations as to why Japan fails to become a democracy and instead becomes a dictatorship is the 1927 financial crisis brought on by an earthquake in Japan a few years earlier, and the assassination of the leading reformist prime minister. Although the more immediate cause of the institution of dictatorship are actually these ultranationalist groups that are present in Japan. And so, encouraged by the Japanese military victories against Russia, you get a faction developing in the Japanese army that's called the Imperial Way faction. They emphasize the Imperial Way. That argues that war with the Soviet Union and China is inevitable, and therefore Japan needs to attack first and take over large parts of these countries while it's in a position of strength. And they develop a secret group called the Cherry Blossom Society, which actually assassinates politicians in Manchuria in an attempt to instigate a Japanese war in Manchuria. And they also draw up these crazy plans for the bombing of Japanese government before it gets disbanded and discovered. You also have ultranationalist groups within the Japanese army, later on called the League of Blood, which attempts to overthrow the government in 1932. They were also trying to assassinate Charlie Chaplin, because he was apparently a symbol of Western decadence while he was visiting. And they actually succeed in assassinating the Prime Minister. The Japanese government imprisons them, but basically lets them out after a few years. They give a very sort of weak response. And this encourages a later coup. So this second coup attempt, they almost succeed in overthrowing the Japanese government. And they assassinate two former prime ministers and nearly succeed in assassinating the current prime minister. And they're only stopped because the emperor comes out and denounces them. And so they're all put into prison. And as a result of this, the more kind of moderate military faction within the government is allowed to completely take over. The emperor decides not to interfere in politics at all. And the parliamentary imperial diet basically just becomes under the thumb of this military oligarchy. So at this point, Japan basically stops being democratic at all and becomes a full-on military dictatorship. So I think because of that, you have to make the case that it is actually these ultranationalist currents, or these nationalist ideas, which forces Japan into becoming less democratic in the end. Another important thing to point out is that in the 1930s, you have the creation of a sort of industrial planning policy, which is a way for Japan to grow its economy, as free trade no longer seems very viable after the 1920s financial crisis. And so what that involves, it's a state planning industrial policy modelled after German National Socialism and Italian corporatism. And so they advocate the creating of economic growth using a railway, by constructing railways in Manchuria and creating Japanese factories there. And so instead of, for example, buying the resources you need from other countries and trading with them, you can simply take over Manchuria and steal all the resources you need from there. And so, so it's important to point out that this kind of National Socialist idea in Germany and Japan, it's adopted as an alternative to free trade, as a way to grow their economies. And kind of imperialist expansion kind of goes along with that, which is the phenomenon that Hayek describes in The Road to Serfdom, that once countries abandon ideals of free trade and start controlling businesses and the economy, they inevitably lead to political tyrannies. And it's actually the same thing kind of happens in China in the 2010s. That after the 2008 financial crisis, the Chinese government becomes convinced that globalism and free trade is no longer in its interest, and it actually has a superior model of state-driven development. And so it embarks on this economic model, which actually sees state-led growth. So it wants to, instead of expanding its economy through free trade, instead wants to use state investments into things like the railway, the high-speed trains, and certain industries, and use that to grow its economy. And actually the Belt and Road over the last few years is China's attempt to replicate this by using the same policy in other countries. And so the result in Japan is that it becomes a military oligarchy, but it's actually kind of prevented from becoming a totalitarian state, which I think it would have done if the leak of blood had taken over in the 1930s. And China today is playing similarly dangerous games by encouraging nationalism among its citizens, which is resulting in numerous violent attacks against foreigners and foreign businesses in China. This was most obvious during the anti-Japanese riots in 2012, which the government initially encouraged and then backtracked once they realised the extent of the looting and violence that was being carried out. Thankfully, China today exists in an international framework that's very different to the interwar years of the 1920s and 30s. So the Chinese government is authoritarian, but it's not totally irrational, so it knows that it can't just use military annexation to get its way around the world, although it tries to do it here and there in the South China Sea. And there's less risk of an ultranationalist faction of the Chinese military taking over the government, which is something ironically because Japan from the beginning kind of merged its military with its political system, which China kind of had a similar structure initially, but because of the Chairman Mao years, and the military was really distanced from the political system because Chairman Mao was so afraid of a military coup. So because of that, China is somewhat less at risk of a kind of ultranationalist military taking over the government. And so there is also the question of, was Japan a totalitarian power? Was it like Nazi Germany? Was it a fascist government? And I think the answer has to be no. I mean, obviously Japan was a pretty brutal military dictatorship, and it was certainly totalitarian in the colonies that it ruled for a brief time. The Nanjing Massacre is the most famous example of Japanese military brutality. No less appalling is the Manila Massacre, where 100,000 Filipinos were killed, or the Siu-Ching Massacre that kills 50,000 Singaporeans, or the genocide against the Suluk Muslims in Borneo. More than 10 million Chinese were sentenced to forced labour in Manchuria, and by some estimates 100,000 prisoners died during the construction of the railway in Burma under Japanese occupation. So in its colonies, Japan actually comes close to the kind of totalitarian state which you do see in fascist states. Similarly, you can see the experiments conducted on prisoners at the Japanese bioweapons facility in Harbin, Unit 731, which could give Joseph Mengele a run for his money. Included things like live vivisections, and purposefully infecting patients with anthrax, and placing prisoners in vacuum chambers which they would depressurize until they exploded. And so you can actually see in Japan the beginnings of a fascist totalitarian movement, which is evidenced by the propaganda and forced confessions that it forces from its citizens. The government even creates something called the Imperial Rule Assistance Association, the IRAA, which is a kind of internal political party which went round sort of spying on people, making sure they supported the government and organising mass rallies, fairly similar to the SS in Nazi Germany. They even had an Imperial Youth faction which was modelled on the Nazi Youth. But these factions in Japan, they never reached the level of power and state repression that was present in Germany or the Soviet Union or Mao's China. And in Japan itself, they never had massive concentration camps where they imprisoned their own citizens. Even at the height of arrests of political dissidents in the 1930s, only a few dozen Japanese militants were ever executed, which is extraordinarily lenient compared to other totalitarian states. So as one Japanese judge said, no thought criminals ever hopeless. Since they were all Japanese, sooner or later they would all come around to realizing that their ideas were wrong. And so, compared to China in the mid-20th century, Japan, although they use extraordinarily brutal military tactics, they never extend the same approach to their own citizens, and they never create a vast totalitarian bureaucracy. So part of the totalitarian doctrine was combining the police and the military and sort of creating warlike conditions in the state itself. What's interesting or notable about China is that after it largely abandoned the ideology of communism, after Mao died, it's become much more like an imperialist power by embracing an ideology of ethno-nationalism, which makes its future policy increasingly uncertain. Okay, that's Japan. Part 2. Kaiserian Germany. Because of the incredibly brutal policies of ethnic repression that China has resorted to towards its ethnic minorities over the last couple of years, comparisons between China and Nazi Germany have been increasingly common. Although this is largely because Nazi Germany is the definitely bad government that most people know about in any great detail. While some comparisons between Nazi Germany and China today might be apt, the comparison that makes much more sense in my view is not Germany under Hitler, but Germany under Kaiser Wilhelm II in World War I. Before democracy was something that most developed countries took for granted, there were many dictators and monarchies that stood opposed to what they saw as Anglo-Saxon liberalism, which they saw as both weak and immoral. The greatest challenge to the dominance of the Anglo-Saxon world order was, of course, the rising state of Germany, which was only unified as recently as 1870, following a policy of nationalism based on the Prussian model of discipline. Comparisons between the shift in global power that took place at the end of the 19th century between Britain and Germany, and the end of the 20th between America and China, was one of the main arguments in Graham Allison's book, Destined for War, which argued that the nature of the two rising powers made war between the USA and China increasingly more likely. Both Germany and China found themselves in a position of being a rapidly developing economy that was modelled on financial protectionism and was challenging the major English-speaking world power for global dominance, and attempting to catch up to it by building the world's largest navy. If you compare them on certain doctrines and specific policies, comparisons break down, but the model of development fits rather well if you just look at the history of Germany's imperial and economic colonial policy. Let me give you some examples. So, in the 1870s, Germany adopts a policy of encouraging Germans to emigrate to other countries to spread German political influence and decrease the risk of revolution, as it was thought that Germany was overpopulated. Later in the 1870s, German economists conceive of an export offensive, which means to overproduce industrial materials and export them around the world to make other countries dependent on the German economy. This period also adopts the theories of Friedrich List, who proposed that Germany should become an industrial heartland with agricultural colonies on the periphery to supply it with food. They argued that German companies should become arms of the state, a policy which was described as organised capitalism. In the 1880s, German policymakers seized on the idea of economic colonization, which they then set about creating colonies in Central and Southern Africa, which would be areas dominated by German industry. Free trade, they said, was just Britain's way of protecting its own financial interests, and human rights were just ideals invented to sanction other countries and stop them from developing. In the 1900s, the government was influenced by the creation of the Pan-German League, which advocated the creation of a massive empire of ethnic Germans and grew to 40,000 members. The German government initially encouraged the growth of the League, but later distanced themselves from them, saying that they were political madmen, with which it was impossible to do business with. The German government increasingly became very militaristic after Kaiser Wilhelm II took power, and he set about creating the world's largest navy and the world's largest land army, which is supposed to challenge British naval dominance. After a number of disputes with other countries in North Africa, the German government in the 1910s embarked on a policy of Weltpolitik that aimed to give Germany a place in the sun. Is any of this starting to sound familiar? If not, then it should. If one replaces Germany with China and changes the dates, most of these policies could describe China over the last 30 years. The Chinese government started to encourage ethnic Chinese to emigrate from China in the early 1990s, and today surveils them using the United Front abroad, and often entices them to steal technology. The German policy of an export offensive is almost identical to the Go Out policy that Jiang Zemin created in the 1990s, where he encouraged Chinese companies to go out and occupy markets in Africa by oversupplying them with cheap products. The policy of moving agricultural production to the periphery was adopted in China by moving agricultural production to countries like Kazakhstan, if only because China polluted so much of its own agricultural land that it couldn't grow crops there. And their rejection of the principles of free trade and human rights shouldn't really need any elaboration. The creation of the world's largest ground army was achieved by the Chinese some time ago, and the creation of the world's largest navy has been their political goal for some time. Even the idea of a pan-Chinese nationalism based on ethnicity has been proposed by several Chinese politicians. The distinction between Chinese mainlanders who happen to live overseas, called Huaqiao, and foreign nationals who are just Chinese ethnicity, called Huaren, has been blurred by a new term called Haiwai Chaobao, which groups the two together and has been adopted by the CCP since 2018. The inaugural World Huaqiao Huaren Businessman Industrialist Conference was created by the Chinese government in 2015 and was an attempt to formulate business policy for ethnic Chinese businessmen. So these are not people who are mainlanders, they just happen to people who may be Singaporean or Malaysian or Australian or Canadian, but happen to be ethnically Chinese. And the Chinese government called on them to be the new effective forces of Chinese industrial policy. The director of Zhongguancun, which is China's Silicon Valley, in 2015 called for the creation of an ethnic Chinese card, which would allow ethnic Chinese to stay and work in China without visa restrictions. This was embraced by many Chinese nationalists, although these proposals haven't yet been followed up on by the Chinese government. Given what ultimately happened in 1914 between Britain and Germany, comparisons between China and Imperial Germany seem more alarming. China in 2020 is actually much more politically closed off and less restrained in many ways than the government of Germany was in 1910. Especially if you take the case of the German historian Fritz Fischer for Germany's involvement in World War I. In something which has become known as the Fischer thesis, the historian Fritz Fischer argues, based on textual documents, that Germany actually instigated World War I as a way to acquire colonial possessions in Africa and Eastern Europe. So he presented something called the September Plan, which was a 1914 German military document that showed the German annexation of the Netherlands, Belgium, parts of France, Ukraine, Poland, the Baltics, Belarus, and numerous territories in Africa, which was supposed to create a German empire called Mittel Europa. And Fischer also points to the discussion of Lebensraum by German military officials, which was not invented by Hitler, was actually a policy invented in World War I. This thesis proved so controversial that Fischer's office was firebombed in Hamburg, but actually his revelations have stood the test of time. And one can see the same manner of thinking, the whole idea that China has been left behind and treated unfairly by the other great powers, and needs to adopt these policies as a way to give it its rightful place in history. They're still present in China today. although we could be very thankful that we live in a very different political landscape to that of Europe in 1914. Chinese plans for global domination instead come in the form of economic domination and political subversion, which are incredibly concerning, but trade wars are preferable to real wars. Comparisons between the two powers do seem to make the case that global conflict is actually more likely than not. But recent history, especially for the Soviet Union, shows that actually such things can be avoided with, carefulness. And the current Chinese establishment has embraced many similarly dangerous doctrines to that of the Prussian establishment. They seem to not be totally irrational, and so it's unlikely they'd calculate that engaging in a massive military offensive would be beneficial to them. So that's Kaiserian Germany. Part 3. The Soviet Union. Probably no historical state comes as close to the internal system of modern China as the Soviet Union does, because the philosophy and the recent history of the two countries is very closely linked. And it's not just true for the Stalinist period, which Chairman Mao tried to copy, but also the later periods in the Soviet Union, which were more characterized by internal political struggle and economic decline, which we've actually seen in China. And one of the difficult things to capture about the Soviet Union is not really just the policy or the communist doctrine, but it's also the kind of cultural madness that takes hold of a society after the revolutionary period, which you can only find in other systems like the French Revolution. So the system appears to be like a sort of mass cult. I mean, like the French revolutionaries, they also created a new calendar with a 5-day work week that was supposed to make work days more efficient. But they also had things like electronic machines that would create rational music, and also artists that would create rational art. They would go into factories and try and inspire factory workers into creating new and innovative designs. So they had all of these crazy ideas. And the scale of political mass worship and repression is probably the greatest example of the totalitarian doctrine, and is only really overshadowed by China during the Cultural Revolution under Mao, where Chairman Mao created massive rallies and songs and even shrines and pilgrimage sites dedicated to him. The whole use of the cult of personality, which appears to be a kind of religion in dictatorships, is explained by the fact that, theories of Marxist dialectics is quite complicated and it's not that easy for most peasants to understand. Whereas worship of a leader or an idol is something that can be more easily communicated to illiterate peasants. So the Great Terror and the mass purges and the gulags under Stalin is the most famous aspect of the Soviet Union, and resulted in the deaths of at least 20 million people. But the fact is that Lenin was also a mass murderer. He killed at least 8 million people by the time he died in 1927, mostly as a result of brutal crackdowns against rebellious territories. And the Soviet Union is often compared more favourably to Nazi Germany, on account that people sort of think that at least it wasn't genocidal. But this kind of misunderstands the nature of the Soviet regime. And this partially because of the fact that the Cold War didn't lead to massive military conflict between the great powers. And historians didn't have access to the archival materials until the 1990s when they opened up. And so that means that the extent of the atrocities in the USSR aren't really very well known by the public today. You also have the fact that the education system still doesn't really teach anything about the atrocities in communist societies. But the fact is that the Soviet Union, and actually most likely China, carried out genocides that were far worse than what happened in Nazi Germany. Even the Holodomor alone, which was the great Ukrainian famine in the 1930s, killed an estimated 7 to 10 million Ukrainians, and the neighbouring famine in Kazakhstan at the same time killed at least 2 million Kazakhs. And as well as this, you had campaigns by both Lenin and Stalin of de-Cossacization, which was the labelling of an ethnic minority called the Cossacks as class enemies, and they were then subjugated to mass purges and mass killings which killed an estimated 300,000 of them in the 1930s. So, unlike in Nazi Germany, when other races were just deemed inferior and therefore were killed on account of that, ethnic minorities in communist societies were simply labelled class enemies and were therefore repressed because they had to be assimilated into the egalitarian aims of the society. And so, ethnic minorities and provinces that were dubbed resistant to this assimilation were persecuted. So Poland, there were NKVD secret police operations in Poland and Mongolia during World War II that killed at least 130,000 people. And later campaigns involved the creation of ethnic enclaves, which were called oblasts, around the Soviet Union, so that populations could be forced into these regions and more carefully surveilled. And this involved the mass forced relocation of millions of ethnic minorities, including the Crimean Tatars and the Ingush people, where tens of thousands died in the process, the most brutal of which was the deportation of the Chechens in 1944 that killed an estimated 100,000 people. And this same policy of creating ethnic autonomous regions was copied by the Chinese communists and still forms the basis of Chinese policy in Tibet and Xinjiang today. So ironically, what they call autonomous regions in China is usually the least autonomous. So in the 1950s, you had the anti-rightist campaign, directed by Chairman Mao as a way to weed out KMT spies and class enemies. And it killed an estimated 5 million people. But we don't really know the exact death toll. But we know that the same campaign was used to create mass imprisonments and mass torture and killings of the Uyghurs and the Tibetans in the 1950s because they had also been labelled class enemies. We also don't know the exact death toll in the famines of the 1950s and how they affected Xinjiang and Tibet because these archives are still closed. But we know the conditions were so bad that in 1962, around 70,000 Xinjiang natives tried to flee China into the Soviet Union, causing Soviet troops to open fire on the people who were fleeing. So we know the conditions would have been so bad for them to risk their lives to do that. The famines of the Cultural Revolution in Tibet killed an estimated 1 to 2 million deaths, according to escaped refugees. And we can extrapolate these same figures to Xinjiang, as being probably even higher. The Cultural Revolution itself in the 1960s instigated countrywide killings against ethnic minorities across China, including the genocide of ethnic Mongolians in the Inner Mongolian province, where an estimated 30 to 100,000 Mongolians were killed. And this was uncovered by a Mongolian historian who's now in prison in China for his research. You also had the mass killings of Hui Muslims in 1974, who were still being repressed in Xinjiang today. And you had a bizarre campaign where the governor of Yunnan was labelled as a spy by Chairman Mao, and a campaign to find people who were allied to him killed 17,000 Miao people in Yunnan. It's common today to talk about cultural genocide in Xinjiang and Tibet. But I mean, really, this kind of covers up what it really is, just real genocide, because we know that at least 2 to 3 million people have been incarcerated in Xinjiang without trial. And refugees who escaped the camps report widespread torture, rape, killings, even live organ harvesting, which was the same tactic used on the Falun Gong, the religious meditation group in the 1990s. We can't know, and we probably won't ever know the extent of the killings in the Xinjiang camps. But during the Falun Gong crackdown, at least 800,000 practitioners were arrested, out of which an estimated 40 to 60,000 were killed, which gives a death rate of 5 to 7% of prisoners. And if you apply that same rate to Xinjiang, because the tactics appear to be very similar, you get a death rate of at least 200,000, and probably quite higher. Also, the Chinese operated massive labour camp systems called the Laogai system, which was very similar to Stalin's gulags. For a long time, it was thought that these camps were not very extensive compared to the Soviet Union. But then in the 1990s, there was an escaped survivor of the camp called Harry Wu, who founded the Laogai Research Foundation, and he revealed in his book that an estimated 40 to 50 million Chinese have been sent to the labour camps over the history of the CCP. And so what is it about the doctrine of communism that makes it so deadly? Because Hannah Arendt, in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, she writes that communism is just one doctrine among many, and actually any ideology, when pushed to the extreme, can become totalitarian. Which is true, but I mean, no ideology apart from communism really killed so many people in history. And so what was it about the doctrine that makes it so dangerous? I mean, I think really it's the fact that the whole concept of the abolition of private property and the abolition of work, really, or private work, means that the state has to control everything to do with a person's life and their labour, which really sets the conditions for slavery and means that people can just be worked to death for the state, which is why it killed so many people. And so to stay in power, totalitarian governments engage in these mass purges, and it's also why they engage in conspiracy theories a lot as a way to justify these purges. And so after Stalin took power and he forced the other communist faction, which was led by Leon Trotsky, into exile, he immediately created the conspiracy that the Trotskyists were a global conspiracy that were trying to overthrow the Soviet Union and had spies everywhere. So anybody who was accused of being a Trotskyist was put into the gulags. And so later, when Trotsky had been murdered in Argentina with an ice pick, it became less conceivable that Trotskyists could be leading a global conspiracy, and so this conspiracy changed to be the fact that it was the British Secret Service and the British royal family that were leading a global conspiracy, and later the CIA were doing the same thing, and that the CIA had brainwashed the entire world to be against the Soviet Union, and that they were driving counter-revolutionary forces. And by the end of Stalin's life, you have these conspiracies getting crazier and crazier. The most bizarre one is called the Doctor's Plot, which is the idea that there were Jewish doctors all over the Soviet Union that were involved in a campaign to kill communist officials. And this drove Stalin's decision to try to create a Jewish ethno-state in Siberia, which he was trying to do before he died. The same rationale has been present in China for a long time. I mean, originally when Mao took power, he had the conspiracy that the KMT had spies everywhere, and they had black hands within communist China. And so that was the excuse for the purges in the 1950s. And later this transformed into the CIA. And so they still do this today. They blame the black hands of the CIA on any kind of like protest or anti-party force within China. So the protests in Hong Kong or the democratic forces in Taiwan arose as a result of the CIA. They even published this report by the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, which concluded that K-pop and Chinese pop and these very feminine music groups in Asia were a result of a plot by the CIA and Japanese intelligence that were trying to make China more effeminate so that it could be infiltrated by Western ideals to weaken it. I mean, that was an actual government report that they made. So dictatorships have this, like, their incredible insecurity, but they're also very narcissistic, and they have these very grandiose ambitions. And they actually create these sort of organizations because they're themselves convinced that there is another organization that's trying to control the world. And so you see this kind of, these crazy ambitions with the insane experiments that were conducted in the Soviet Union, which included attempts to create a human-ape hybrids, and attempts to make things like a dog with two heads. And the massive biological weapons program that the Soviets created, which involved the creation of anthrax warheads that were aimed at the United States, and the attempt to make weapons that could control the climate. You can see the same trend in China today, where they had these crazy projects like creating biologically engineered soldiers and police dogs, and plans to create a giant artificial moon to redirect sunlight, and an underwater colony that's run by robots. I mean, that's a real thing they're trying to do. And so China today, despite holding on to a lot of the communist doctrine, it's not really comparable to the Soviet Union under Stalin, which it was under Mao. Because after the death of Mao, it does adopt a more of a free market policy, and it's largely stuck to it, and it also scales back the political repression. You never get anything equivalent to the mass deportations or the mass killings that you do under Mao. And so China today actually has quite a lot more in common with the Soviet Union of the 1970s than it does with the Soviet Union of the 1950s. So specifically under Leonid Brezhnev, Brezhnev had an ambitious premier called Alexei Kosygin, who put forward a new economic proposal in 1964 to revive the Soviet economy. And because Soviet economic output had ground to a halt, and he realised that central planning couldn't really hope to regulate the complexity of a modern economy. And to get around this, he proposed giving industries more financial independence so that they could be rewarded based on their profits, and that they could use their own profits how they wanted. So in other words, they could invest it, and that their goods could be sold at real prices rather than the prices that the government set. This policy was introduced in 1965 and scaled up over the next few years. They even had a computer program which was supposed to more efficiently track prices. And it was very successful. It increased Soviet economic growth far more than in the previous decade. But then eventually, after a couple of years, it saw a massive conservative backlash in the party, led by Brezhnev and other reformers who decried it as being revisionist or pro-capitalist, and so a lot of these economic reforms were reversed. And this led to partially the Brezhnev decline, which was where Soviet economic growth was very, very low for the next decade. And eventually this would inspire Gorbachev to create his Glasnost, where he said that I saw economic reform reversed in the 1960s, and if we don't have political openness now, then the same thing will happen today. So in contrast to China, where in China the economic reform was mostly driven by independent villagers and entrepreneurs, more from the bottom up than the top down, and there was a big emphasis on foreign investment. And another important thing comparing it with China is that you had, because of the Cultural Revolution, actually the Cultural Revolution destroyed large parts of the party. And so in the 70s, basically a lot of the peasants just start making privatized farms themselves. And the party actually can't, they try to stop this, but they can't, because the cadres just won't obey them. And so ironically, Chairman Mao, by creating the Cultural Revolution, he actually makes China the more successful leader of the socialist camp, like he wanted to. The Soviet Union in the 1960s could have achieved what China did in the late 70s if it weren't for the entrenched political opposition. And so the Chinese understanding of why the Soviet Union broke up is related to this. So there's some arguments in China that say that it was all Gorbachev's fault. Gorbachev was a weak leader and he allowed corruption, and because of his political openness, it all fell apart. The second argument is that the Soviet Union was too dogmatic, that it failed to embrace economic reform because it was too obsessed with the communist doctrine. This one is actually correct in my view. And the third argument is that it was all the result of evil Western forces that made it collapse. The second view is largely the view of the Deng Xiaoping camp, like from the 90s onwards, whereas the last view seems to be the view of Xi Jinping. In many ways, Xi Jinping is actually comparable to Brezhnev in the 1970s because his government also reacted against a very economically ambitious premier, Zhu Rongji, who'd created a very successful Chinese economy in the 1990s and 2000s. And Xi Jinping's government actually reversed many of these reforms, which has meant that Chinese economic growth has actually slowed down a considerable amount, far more than is being reported. Brezhnev also engaged in a massive anti-corruption campaign, which, like Xi's anti-corruption campaign, was not very successful. Also, just like Xi Jinping, Brezhnev also tried to revive the cult of personality, and he also strengthened massively the secret police. And so there's a lot of parallels. Obviously, in the end, none of his reforms were very successful. The final obvious comparison is that in the 70s, the Soviet Union had a massive espionage campaign that was designed to steal Western technology and use it to drive the Soviet economy. So CIA reports found that KGB agents were undercover as journalists, as scientists and doctors, and created businesses as fronts all over Europe as a way to steal technology. Specifically for the military, microchips, nuclear energy. And China today is the exact same thing, except that it also uses cyber espionage on top of everything else. I mean, Huawei's entire business model is based on just stealing technology that Apple uses and using it to make cheaper phones. So if you go to a Huawei store, it's pretty much indistinguishable from an Apple store. And the CIA in the 1980s managed to counteract this by installing kill switches and defects into technology that they knew the Soviet Union was stealing. And so one hopes they could do the same thing today with China. So China today is essentially an economically reformed and more technologically advanced version of the Soviet Union. And so the Chinese government learned many things from the USSR, and it attempted to correct them. So the party streamlined the financial sector and allowed corrupt businesses to fail in the 1990s. And it grew its economy mostly with foreign investment and exports. It also introduced the patriotic education campaign to indoctrinate children to love the Communist Party and love Chairman Mao. And so even today, if you teach in a Chinese school, you'll see the children walk around on these communist marches and have to do flag raising ceremonies and sing communist songs. And they also designed to allow greater freedom for entrepreneurs and to incorporate them into the party and not to overspend on military budgets. Although really the Chinese government failed to actually solve the political problems that the USSR had, because as we've seen, their economic reforms only really worked as long as you had a sort of balance of power within the party and a kind of consensus about economic growth. And because they never solved the problem of succession, as in like how do you choose the next leader, as soon as you had an ambitious leader like Xi, he was able to just come along and get rid of a lot of these reforms. And so now China's gone back in the direction of state planning. And so that's the Soviet Union. Part 4. Singapore and other minor states. With few exceptions, democracy has not brought good government to new developing countries. What Asians value may not necessarily be what Americans or Europeans value. Westerners value the freedoms and liberties of the individual. As an Asian of Chinese cultural background, my values are for a government which is honest, effective, and efficient. That was Lee Kuan Yew, the founder of Singapore, in 1992. So when Lee gives that quote about democracy, he clearly has in mind his neighbouring country Malaysia, which the wealthier Chinese minority broke away from in the 1960s to found Singapore and established itself as a trading port under basically a British colonial model that had already governed it for the previous century and a half. So Malaysia under British rule had seen the importation of Chinese migrants to work in various industries like mining, and also Indian immigrants to do the same thing. And this would form the basis of materials that could be traded out of the port city of Singapore. And this added ethnic groups into Malaysia, which already had a dominant Muslim population who had settled in the 11th century, displacing the Sarawakis and other ethnic groups who live in Borneo. When Malaysia became independent, it adopted a constitution along ethnic lines, which ensured that the country's leader has to be a Muslim and an ethnic Malay. The other two democratic parties in Malaysia are ethnic parties dominated by the Chinese and the Indians, and all that happens is that these parties never win, and they only ever advocate for their ethnic group. And although the Malays are an ethnic majority in Malaysia, the other minorities have to pay taxes and affirmative action towards them because they're less prosperous. And so while Malaysia is nominally a democracy, for a long time it was very ineffective and pretty much unable to function as one. And it only became ranked as democratic by most researchers in 2014. And so this was clearly what Lee Kuan Yew was hoping to avoid when he founded Singapore. Because he said several times that if he created democracy in Singapore, the Chinese would want one thing, the Indians would want another, the Muslims would want another, and nothing would get done. And so he was content to allow some democratic reforms, which involved legislative elections in the 1980s, and he was happy to allow other political parties to be created. But the ruling political party, the People's Action Party, has remained in power ever since, and uses basically draconian anti-defamation laws to punish other political activists or protesters who try and challenge it. When Deng Xiaoping visits Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore for the first time in 1978, he was blown away by the massive differences between the living standards in China and in Singapore. And he complains to Lee that China was so vast and complicated. Well, Singapore was basically just a city, so that China could never develop in the same way that Singapore had. But to Lee, this was just excuse making. And he tells Deng that there's nothing that Singapore has done that China could not do. And this clearly had an effect on Deng, because just a year later, he embarks on his reform and opening up policy, which allows foreign investment into China to develop many cities around China, including Shenzhen, Shanghai, Xiamen, and they go on eventually to become the most prosperous cities in China today. And in the 1990s, Singapore would become seen as a model by a new generation of Chinese leaders. And around 22,000 Chinese officials were reportedly sent to study its political model. And they're mostly concerned with how to develop China, or how the country was able to achieve rapid growth, but managed to keep one political party in total control. And these same methods were basically used to create the growth of Shanghai and Shenzhen in the 90s into major economic cities. And this faction within the Chinese government developed into a group called the Shanghai Clique, basically led by Zhu Rongji and Jiang Zemin and people like that. Even Xi Jinping, when he first came into power, he often praised the Singapore model of good governance. And he actually based his own programs of anti-corruption and strengthening the rule of law on Singapore, and went around emphasizing the strength of Asian values in creating good economic systems, which was sort of part of that's part of the whole CCP's pivot into embracing Confucianism and Chinese culture. However, on closer inspection, one will see that the Chinese emulation of Singapore is fairly superficial, and that the CCP only really sees what it wants to see in Singapore. Because the whole idea of a Singaporean model has pretty much fallen by the wayside, because in Singapore in 2011, it allowed uncontested elections, and a majority of Singaporeans were allowed to vote for the first time. And although, because of this, the legal system, they didn't win very many seats, but they actually allowed seats to be won by other parties, and pretty much set up like the Westminster system in many other British colonies, former British colonies. And so Singapore has moved over time more and more in the direction of greater political freedom and more democracy and free speech, while China's moved in the exact opposite direction, curtailing free speech, shutting down NGOs and abolishing term limits. And so apart from a few dozen window cities like Beijing, Shanghai and Shenzhen, there's very little else that China has really learned from Singapore. I mean, they completely failed to recognise that Singapore's strength, just like in Hong Kong, lay in its very rigorous and independent legal system that has a large emphasis on property rights. I mean, anyone who's lived in China will know that the law is very much just a guideline. It's sort of just made up, and is very not consistently enforced, which is one of the main problems in China. And so, because the legal system is independent from the executive, it's able to balance out the kind of ambitions of the executive branch. And because of these structural problems, Xi's anti-corruption campaign has been a complete failure. I mean, China is actually ranked as more corrupt than it was when Xi first came to power in 2012. And so any move towards openness or allowing political opposition is just anathema to the CCP, as they just perceive it as weakening their hold on power or leading to the breakup of China. And so for all their talk of a new authoritarian model, and Singapore being the best example of this, I think Singapore actually has proven the opposite. And so yes, if you have a legal system, a strong legal system based on property rights, with an executive branch that is restrained, that's good for economic growth. I mean, who knew? Who could have predicted that? And so it is true that in China, if you travel far enough east, you will find cities that are similar in development to Singapore. But it's also true that if you travel far enough west, you'll find areas that are about as developed as North Korea. And so the other minor states. I think it's worthwhile here talking about some of the other small authoritarian states that have experimented with a kind of economic authoritarianism that seems similar to Singapore. So the United Arab Emirates and the other Gulf states are probably good examples of this. I mean, the UAE in particular, because it has this federalist model of different states that are allied under a kind of a monarchy, which is basically, it's interesting in a way because the monarchy is very restrained because it exists within this federalist model. It's almost like a model of the early European states. And so it's been able to attract a great deal of foreign investment and has invested a lot of this into infrastructure. And obviously, a lot of this wealth comes from oil, but it's also a constitutional monarchy that's somewhat limited. And so the UAE and other countries like Qatar and Saudi Arabia even have moved to modernize infrastructure and strengthen legislation, hoping to provide better standards of living for its people. The country is still relatively corrupt and has very, very draconian blasphemy laws. But at least compared to other parts of the world, it's somewhat of a model of economic development. So it's interesting that, unlike industrializing countries, and throughout most of history that had to tax their citizens to get state power, a lot of these countries in the Middle East basically just get their wealth from their oil, or they can just use nationalized industries to strengthen the state. And so Saudi Arabia, for example, doesn't have any taxes at all. And so there's not a whole lot of demand for political representation because people don't have to pay taxes. And so that's their model of development. And so a lot of these states have been trying to reduce their dependence on oil money and create better infrastructure. So whether they'll succeed at all remains to be seen. But I think, if anything, a lot of these Middle Eastern autocracies have proven that the better models of development are based on a rule of law, legislative independence, property rights, and investment in public institutions and education. China has actually, by contrast, shown an ability to create a very strong meritocratic system and create public institutions that work fairly well. I mean, one of the good things about China compared to other dictatorships is that China isn't a sort of family-based oligarchy, because it has this long tradition of like the civil service exam and these sort of Confucian hierarchy, so that China's not run by like 10 families. It has a fairly high turnover in terms of representation. I mean, although you sort of have like the princeling faction in Xi Jinping, but apart from that, there is like the bureaucracy. But exactly how beneficial this is now that they have a dictator for life is sort of questionable. Russia and Iran are actually ruled by corrupt oligarchies that have produced very little innovations in the way of a model that anybody would look to. So the only other country that's sort of an authoritarian model that's worth mentioning probably is Vietnam, which is it's in a very curious position of being one of the few nominally communist countries still left, but it has a far less repressive system than China and is much more economically free, and is completely ideologically opposed to China. Out of all countries in the world, when surveyed on favourability of China, Vietnam dislikes China the most. And I think this is because they were historically a province of China and ruled by them for a long time. Even the Chinese name for Vietnam, Yunnan, which used to be Nanyu, means the southern province. And also China has in recent history, tried to invade Vietnam, like in 1979, and has many conflicts with it over the South China Sea. And so Vietnam is still a one-party socialist state, but has allowed independent representation and legislative elections since 2002, although it's still very corrupt and only a handful are actually, in reality, allowed to be elected. But in a way, it's like because the government is not very interventionist, it's allowed some economic prosperity. And actually, Vietnam today is a lot like China was probably in the 90s and 2000s. And so, but because they clearly are ideologically opposed to China, it might be that they continue to develop along those lines and eventually open up. One can only hope. But until then, we'll see. Part 5, Nazi Germany. So I saved the best for last, the one I'm sure that many people have been waiting for. The reason I think it has to be handled carefully is the fact that the legacy of the Nazis is probably the most misused historical period ever. Probably know the term Godwin's Law. In any argument on the internet, someone will eventually mention Hitler. In a sense, it's pointless comparing any government to Nazi Germany because of how unusual it is as a historical phenomenon. You can obviously make comparisons with other communist states and even other fascist states, but none really compare to the kind of state that Nazi Germany was. I mean, for one thing, like, yes, Hitler was a socialist, and the fact that this is even debated about today shows you how disingenuous a lot of the debate is. I mean, very few people at the time were, like, when Hitler was a rising political figure, disputed the fact that he preached a socialist doctrine. I mean, it was something he openly talked about in his speeches. Just like Mussolini, who was also a socialist before he embraced fascism, Hitler saw National Socialism as a way to solve the contradictions of socialism, and he saw it as a natural conclusion of the doctrine. It was supposed to be a kind of middle-class socialism that would represent the enlightened will of the elites, rather than the tyranny of the mob, which is what communism represented. And in fact, most of Hitler's complaints about the Jews originated from the fact that they were supposedly driving communism in Russia. And so in Mein Kampf and his table talks, he openly says that the Soviet Union is actually run by ethnic Jews and ethnic Germans because of the fact that Slavs were apparently incapable of ruling themselves. So it's important to note that Hitler's National Socialism has its origin in the pan-German movement. And really that was Hitler's military strategy. I mean, that was why the whole idea of Lebensraum, creating a living space in Eastern Europe which ethnic Germans would rule, which he didn't invent, it was invented in World War I. It was what drove his annexation of the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, where ethnic Germans lived, and what drove his invasion of Poland and the Austrian vote to unify with Germany. He didn't want to start a war with Britain or the United States, although he was prepared to run the risk of it, and then blamed the Jews for pulling them into the war. But the whole idea was that, again, Germany, similar to World War I, the whole idea was that Germany had been left behind and treated unfairly, and that it had this sort of natural place in history. And therefore, if all ethnic Germans around Europe were unified, and therefore it would naturally be a defense against the communist states. And so, yeah, people who look into it might notice that there's not really that much difference between the National Socialism that Hitler thought of and the socialism in one country that was proclaimed by Stalin. Both are totalitarian doctrines, and both advocated the complete abolition of a distinction between state and private life. Socialism is actually an authoritarian doctrine, and it kind of always has been since its conception. And I'm not talking here about, wealthy European welfare states, which exist inside governments that are very limited constitutionally and have a very clear free market role, but the actual socialist doctrine which advocates the complete government takeover of the entire economy. And that's why most people today are actually very mistrustful of a lot of socialists, because a lot of them simply see democratic socialism as the first step towards full communism. And they're often completely happy to be allied with communists or openly communist and see no problem with this, and just simply refuse to acknowledge all of the atrocities that the communist doctrine has been responsible for. So, I mean, if socialists just kind of like completely disassociated themselves from communists, in my view, they do a lot better in elections, to be honest. And so while the institutionalist theorists can find a lot of support for their theories in many cases, I think Nazi Germany probably makes the best case for a government which is actually a result of an ideology, which doesn't mean that there's no precedent in history for it, because other political doctrines obviously inspired by books like, Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto or Jean-Jacques Rousseau for the French Revolution. You could even argue that Charles Darwin or Francis Galton had a sort of created a doctrine for the kind of British Victorian establishment. But for the Nazis, the single thinker that inspired them was Friedrich Nietzsche. Hitler had a portrait of Nietzsche in his office, and Goebbels carried a copy of Nietzsche's book everywhere he went. And even Hitler's propaganda films, like The Triumph of the Will, was named after one of Nietzsche's books. What's another strange thing about the Nazis is how Hitler was involved in these pagan cults when he was younger, and he had this strange relationship with Christianity, where later he described himself as a messiah. But when he was younger, Hitler and some of the other Nazis were involved in something called the Thule Society, which was an occult group that taught that the mythical German people, who were the pure Aryan race, came to the European continent from an unknown land that was thought to be Iceland, and sometimes called Thule, sometimes Atlantis. And the Aryans were supposed to be a superior group who had ruled over other races in Europe, but had lost that dominant position over time by breeding with them. And so Hitler was very interested in this, obviously, but later apparently just didn't really have much time for it. Although many members of the Thule Society would later join the Nazi Party. Himmler, who was the real orchestrator of the Holocaust, he specifically modelled the SS on the Jesuit Society because he founded them a kind of order of discipline and sense of mission that he wanted to emulate in the SS. And he purposefully tried to combine sort of pagan German mysticism with Nazi doctrine, so created these pagan holidays like a Yuletide. And they apparently had these candlelit dinners decorated with pagan Germanic symbols. And he even established a specific archaeological society that was tasked with finding evidence of the superior Aryan race. And he sent missions to Tibet in search of Shangri-La and to the Andes. And so Himmler himself was also an admirer of Theravada Buddhism and used meditation techniques to try and clear his mind and disassociate himself from the killings that he was doing, just like some of the Japanese kamikaze pilots. So I think a lot of these instances show that the Nazis really believed in what they preached, at least when it came to the racial theories, which many observers at the time found hard to believe that they took seriously. The SS units that were tasked of going into European countries and finding blonde-haired, blue-eyed children, then kidnapping them and taking them back to Germany as a way to sort of rescue the pure German race from the other inferior Europeans. I mean, they had other policies like the mass killings of mentally disabled people, or the purposefully matching husbands and wives together based on superior genetic traits. I mean, the fact that they did all of this in secret, or a lot of it in secret at first, proves that it wasn't just a sort of doctrine to indoctrinate the masses. It was something they really believed in. And also, in spite of a lot of what is said against the Nazis, the economic revival of the German economy in the 1930s was very real. It did happen. And that's because, war-like conditions and mass territorial expansion and forced creation of industry does create economic growth in the short term. I mean, that was kind of the basis of Keynesianism. And these were the same policies that the Japanese used in Manchuria. But just like the Japanese, the whole model depended on territorial expansion, because once you've ruled out free trade, you can't buy that coal and steel that you might like. You can go and conquer a land that has some of it. And the Nazis were also terrible at producing the same economic conditions in the areas that they ruled, like all of these systems. And so they just wanted to turn Eastern European Slavs into slaves, just like the Jews, and have them work in the camps. And so if they'd actually won the war, they would have presided over and eventually a declining economy, like the Soviet Union did, although one could argue they may have been less dogmatic about it. And so China today, in spite of all its incredibly brutal human rights violations, doesn't really come close to embracing the scale of political fanaticism or the urge for territorial expansion that the Nazis had, thankfully. Interestingly, Hannah Arendt observed that perhaps the more dangerous form of totalitarianism lay not with the fanaticism of Hitler and Stalin, but in the cold calculation of Himmler and Molotov. And this kind of cold calculation may actually be now what rules China in the form of Xi Jinping, who is a very bureaucratic and calculating person, which is why his power grab sort of took so many people by surprise. And like the rest of the CCP, he claims to have transcended ideology altogether and be purely pragmatic. I mean, which is not true, but that's the claim. Although, in spite of all of his carefulness, the theories that he does espouse is somewhat disconcerting. I mean, I try never to really to make comparisons with Nazi Germany because it's so misconstrued. But you have to make an exception with China because there are some Nazi thinkers that Xi Jinping has apparently reported openly embracing, and there appears to be an alliance between sort of Xi's technocrats and the sort of Han ultra-nationalists who are an emerging sort of cultural movement in China. So the Nazi legalist philosopher Carl Schmitt has been quoted by Xi Jinping as being one of his favourite philosophers. Schmitt was writing in Weimar, Germany, on the nature of dictatorship, and he sought to remove any taboo around the word dictator. And as he saw it, a dictatorship was merely an executive government that was different to a sort of slow legislative process. And he said that the leader should exercise the right to occasionally suspend the rule of law and to step outside of it to suspend the country's constitution, which may be all well and good until the dictator, instead of picking just the right moment to step outside the rule of law, decides that actually he can do without them. So Schmitt's writings have had quite a significant influence on the formation of a legal code in China under Xi, according to several academics. Given the fact that he legitimized strong party, one-party rule and dictatorship, it's not hard to see why Xi likes him so much. And so apart from embracing Nazi legal philosophy, he at least doesn't appear to be openly embracing their racial doctrines. But the idea of a rising Chinese nationalism has been part of an academic discourse in China since at least the early 1990s. And some people have questioned whether this is actually the case or whether it's reflective in government policy. And we now actually have evidence that it is reflective. So during the 2008 Olympics, China was exposed to Western media a lot more than it had been in the past, and citizens in Tibet and Xinjiang took the opportunity to raise awareness about persecution and organised protests and what later devolved into riots against the Chinese government. And the result of this was a change in the Chinese approach towards ethnic minorities in the Chinese intellectual class led by a writer called Hu Angang, who criticised the policy of the previous administration of promoting ethnic minorities as distinctive. And he argued that this had led to a desire for separatism among the Uyghurs and Tibetans, and instead they had to be assimilated into Han culture. The government should create a state race, a unified state race of a mixture of Han and all other minorities, and that should become government policy. And Hu Angang's essay later became one of the most cited and published within the Communist Party, and it forms a policy in Xinjiang and Tibet today. And so, to create this state race, China already has policies of subsidizing Han citizens, giving them money if they settle in these minority areas, and they also started subsidizing ethnic Han Chinese who marry Uyghur women or marry Tibetan women. They created these model unity villages for propaganda, which shows Uyghurs and Han people living side by side, and even created a program that allows the Han Chinese police to live in the homes of Uyghur women whose husbands have been sent to the concentration camps. Another example of rising nationalist militarism over the years has been shown by the increased incursions into the South China Sea and the numerous rising threats within the Chinese military to invade Taiwan. Chinese state media repeatedly shows military vehicles firing missiles and troops landing in mock invasions of Taiwan. And the Chinese government allows massive anti-Japanese protests to take place and often encourages nationalist demonstrations. And during this coronavirus crisis, reports have shown that the government's basically engaged in a kind of digital cultural revolution where nationalist voices on the Chinese internet are amplified and funded by the Chinese government, whereas people's criticism of nationalism are either censored or just drowned out by these internet movements like the Wu Mao's 50 Cent Army or the Little Pinks, the Xiao Fen Hong. And this has created actually an incredibly dangerous and vocal ultra-nationalist movement among Chinese mainlanders, which I've seen myself firsthand. It's resulted, among other things, in the firebombing of Falun Gong offices in Hong Kong, the stabbing of Hong Kong activists, roaming nationalist Chinese gangs that attack random foreigners. Chinese historians have been attacked, beat up and labelled as Han traitors. You have massive cyber warfare campaigns directed at other governments in Southeast Asia. And you have internet posts recently calling on the Chinese government to kill every environmentalist, kill every feminist and every human rights activist. And not only are these posts allowed to stay, but they're given hundreds of thousands of likes. Other Chinese writers openly advocate for the invasion of Taiwan, and for the German policy of Lebensraum. Also advocate that Vietnam and Kazakhstan and Mongolia all want to return to Chinese rule, although the government does occasionally censor these posts if they get too extreme. And what's more worrying is that the use of the Great Firewall and the indoctrination of Chinese mainlanders now means that the vast majority of Chinese people simply quietly accept this sentiment. Even Chinese who have been abroad, they're unlikely to ever read foreign news, because they simply just use Chinese apps, Chinese media sites, and they just basically live in these insulated Chinese bubbles with other mainlanders, so that the CCP narrative is never challenged. And as one Chinese mainlander living abroad put it, she said that the fact that Taiwan is an eternal part of China was presented as fact as evident as the fact that the Earth is round. Perhaps the reason that so many young Chinese people adopt nationalism is that there's simply no other ideology you're really allowed to have in modern China. I mean, ideas of human rights and universal values are censored in the state media. Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and even Confucianism are all heavily censored. Either heavily censored or state-sponsored and co-opted versions of them are created so that their actual universal message is diluted. Even communism is repressed as an ideology, as there are communist activists in 2018 who held rallies for workers' rights and were then arrested by the government. Nationalism was actually explicitly proposed by Chinese intellectuals in the 1990s as a way, because it was feared that if they didn't embrace nationalism, then China would break up like the Soviet Union did. And this was the rationale behind the patriotic education campaign that now indoctrinates Chinese children in schools and has now come full circle. In spite of this, however, there's evidence that the whole idea of a rising Chinese nationalism is somewhat overblown. Researchers who've attempted to quantify nationalism among the Chinese youth have found that, interestingly, younger Chinese are actually much less nationalist than their parents and the people before them. And while they do support their government in almost all their claims, they're very unlikely to support military intervention. And they only around 10 to 12% support military intervention. And they're far more likely to favour cooperative or diplomatic solutions, which is actually what the Chinese government still does. And so it's worth pointing out that these fanatical displays of nationalism, of people sort of going crazy and throwing things, these have actually been found to often have been funded directly by the CCP. And so is a lot of this online activity, which means that the idea of a support for a nationalist movement is somewhat distorted, and they're actually kind of a small minority that are just incredibly amplified. And this research found that Chinese nationalism peaked in 1999, around the time of the Belgrade embassy bombing, and in 2009, just after the 2008 Olympics. And clearly we're going through another nationalist peak now, which is basically the government's way to divert attention away from its massive mishandling of this crisis. And so while China has increasingly embraced nationalism and Han chauvinism as its leading doctrine, and it's also become more totalitarian, it doesn't quite come close to the radical doctrines of the Nazis. And it's only able to enforce these assimilationist policies in its minority regions. In the rest of the country, where there's actually a very strong middle class, so far has held off trying anything similar, although with the social credit score and these sort of mass surveillance systems, that might change. So, in conclusion, modern China has succeeded in becoming the leader of a global authoritarian camp, just like it tried to become the leader of a global socialist camp during the Cold War, which means that it is actively exporting its authoritarian system around the world, just as the Soviet Union did. But because of the international order that's been created since then, it's much more limited in its global ambitions. And we're comparing it to other authoritarian states that the world has seen over the last century and a half. China resembles something that's a mixture between a more economically and technologically advanced version of the Soviet Union, but in many ways is similar to the imperialist powers of the early 20th century, as it's increasingly embraced an ethno-nationalist Chinese doctrine. Although at the moment this has more in common with the kind of Asian exceptionalist ideas of Imperial Japan than it does of the supremacy of the Third Reich. This does not mean that China could not potentially develop into a radical, fanatic political state, but at the moment it's at least able to keep such forces at arm's length. So as disconcerting as the Chinese ultranationalists are, they're not really comparable to the death squads of the League of Blood or the SS in the 1930s. So in contrast to the imperialist powers and the newer authoritarian models, like Singapore and the UAE, which increased economic power by strengthening property rights and creating a limited constitutional executive branch, China has moved away from the model of an oligarchy that it had in the 90s and 2000s and is increasingly going more towards, it appears to be in the early stages of a totalitarian doctrine. But because of the middle class it's created, it's much more limited in its state repression. So what is characteristic of totalitarian states is the cult of personality and the mass purges of the political establishment and of all intellectual life. So Xi Jinping has engaged in mass purges of the party using a so-called anti-corruption campaign, and he's purged non-government organisations during the 709 crackdown in 2015. And also more recently, the government moved away from economic liberalism after the 2015 Chinese stock market crash and instead adopted a policy of mandatory state mergers and trying to grow the economy based on state-led growth, but has since then become increasingly unproductive and has also curtailed intellectual life by banning university debates and banning discussion among its officials about new legislation, and has become increasingly more pro-censorship online. So what's all the more disheartening about this is that this happened at the exact moment when China would have benefited the most from being more politically open. And the overall question about why China backtracked and became more authoritarian is important, because it can't really be the case that everything's blamed on Xi Jinping alone. And because there are several sort of underlying global events that I think also led to it. The first is the 2008 financial crisis. It not only gave the Chinese political class the sense that their model of development was superior to the West, but convinced them that they didn't really need to rely on Western cooperation to succeed. And the ethnic riots that happened afterwards in the same year also played a large part in informing the Xinjiang policy. This later had a lot to do with the rise of ISIS and the spread of terror in the region. Other factors were the Arab Spring in 2011, because this is something that is actually mentioned in Chinese propaganda, because it triggered protests in China, which is called the Jasmine Revolution, and the takeover of a city called Wukan. All of that convinced the CCP that political fragmentation was a possibility and that the liberalization that China had undergone in the 2000s had to be reversed. And that is actually, I think, what precipitated the wave of internet censorship and crackdown on political freedoms. And also the prosperity in China created massive corruption and inequality, which then created a conservative backlash in the form of Xi Jinping and his anti-corruption effort. A few years later, the 2015 stock market crash would lead Xi and others to abandon the free market policies that they'd adopted and instead opt for massive state mergers and try and pursue growth using state-led industry like the railway and factories, just like Japan did after 1927. So both China and Japan tried to do it using the railway in other countries, and in China this just comes in the form of the Belt and Road. The 2015 crash also initiated another purge of civil society, which was the 709 crackdown on human rights lawyers. And I think the national populist revolt in Western countries in 2016 seems to have played a role in Xi's decision that the West was weak, and therefore he could take total control of the CCP in 2018, because he alluded to this later in a speech. And since then it's directed a much more aggressive foreign policy towards the rest of the world. Although, of course, none of these things could be possible without China's authoritarian system and political doctrine and faulty institutions that were already in place. And so the question now, as the coronavirus unfolds, is whether China will turn into something resembling a totalitarian state and become increasingly ultranationalist, or whether it will backtrack, and what the rest of the world should do about it. And I think this depends entirely on whether Xi is able to survive the massive challenges over the next couple of years. Assuming he does, also whether he's able to exert greater control. Because so far he's been able to effectively purge most people who challenged him. And so this possibility has to be taken seriously. You can also see a case where this sort of political instability may lead China to lash out militarily, either towards Taiwan or other areas of interest in Southeast Asia. Just as a way to deflect popular unrest, which is something that dictatorships often do. So that's pretty much it. If you've made it to the end, then well done. I know it's very, very long, but I thought it was a worthwhile video to make. This is probably going to be the last long video I'll make in quite a while, and now I'm going to make quite a series of short videos. So, yep, thank you for listening.